Now, some of you might be thinking I'm describing our post-apocalyptic future, but it's actually a glimpse into Earth's past. 55.8 million years ago. With so many people trying to undermine the severity of climate change and the threat that it poses to our near future, I decided I would make a video explaining my thoughts as to why it should be taken seriously and the actions that we should take to prevent the potentially irreversible destruction of our planet. One point that I've heard several climate change deniers bring up is that these drastic changes in climate are all cyclical, and the Earth will heat up and cool down regardless of what humans do. Now, I'm sure like many of you, I've heard of several periods in history where Earth has experienced extremely cold temperatures and tundra-like conditions across the globe, such as the various ice ages throughout the years. But this had me wondering if there was ever actually a period where we got extreme increases in temperature across the planet. So I met with one of my professors and explained to him my question. He advised me to research the PETM. The PETM stands for the Paleocene-Eocene Thermal Maximum. Let me break it down for you. The Paleocene-Eocene part represents when it occurred. Earth's history is broken down into 3 eras which are divided into periods and then further divided into epochs. The PETM falls between the Paleocene and Eocene epoch, which were around 65 million years ago to 34 million years ago. And the thermal maximum part of the PETM means really hot. During the PETM, temperatures rose by nearly 10 degrees Fahrenheit globally in just a few thousand years. So, case closed. There you have it. Earth's climate is all cyclical. We have periods where we get tundra-like conditions and periods where we get extremely hot conditions. Thanks for watching, everyone. Okay, not really. I decided to look more into the cause of this sudden increase in heat and found it actually parallels our current situation better than I could have expected. Scientists were able to use plankton shells and study the composition of carbon and oxygen found in them to determine that there must have been a massive increase in carbon and methane present in the air during this time, which is what led to the rise in global temperatures. So now we have historical evidence that this release in greenhouse gases into the atmosphere results in an increase in temperatures. But what exactly happened? What was the result of these new extreme conditions? We know for sure that there were severe droughts, but even worse, there were severe floods. Strong ocean evaporation led to an increase in rainfall, and scientists believe it is likely that any ice that was present would have surely been melted, which resulted in a slight rise in sea level. Thankfully, during this time period, Earth didn't have the polar ice caps and glaciers we have now, so it's unlikely that the sea levels rose drastically. However, these floods would dramatically change the vegetation and subsequently the wildlife that relied on it for habitat or source of food. This period undoubtedly created mass extinction across the globe, and not just on land, but I'll get to that in a bit. My question, and I'm sure what you're all wondering too, is how did this all come to an end? What changed? It's the ocean that took the brunt of this damage. The ocean absorbed the heat as well as the carbon, which would result in sea life's worst nightmare: ocean acidification. Ocean acidification is when the carbon in the air is absorbed by the water and essentially kills everything in the water. Crustaceans can't build and maintain their shells, and some fish aren't able to detect predators as easily, making them more susceptible as prey, which throws off the dynamic of ecosystems. There are several other horrible effects of ocean acidification, but I'm sure you can understand how these impacts would combine to cause a mass extinction of sea creatures. Now that we understand our history, we can better understand where our future lies. At this time, I would like to give my fellow Americans a round of applause. Yeah, that's right. Good job. Yeah, that's right. Congratulations, America. You are the #1 country in the world in carbon emissions per capita. And depending where you look, we have a pretty comfortable lead too. I would like to remind you that this video isn't meant for climate change deniers as much as it is for people who can recognize it but say that we don't really have to do anything about it. And yes, these people exist, and I'll go more in depth on this a little later. To them, I just want to ask, do the effects of the PETM scare you? And right now it's starting to look a lot more like where we were headed. Remember when I said that it took a few thousand years to heat up just 10 degrees Fahrenheit? Well, since 1880, the global average temperature has increased by nearly 2 degrees Fahrenheit. 2/3 of that increase has been from 1975 to now. Surely with the US contributing to a massive amount of CO2 emissions, the government is recognizing this as a serious issue and rolling out that policy that would actually put some restrictions on companies to reduce the effect, right? Of course not. I found an article from National Geographic that lists over 100 actions over the past 4 years that either undermine or completely reverse previous policy to combat climate change. It would really take up way too much time to go into all that, but I'll put a few on the screen. I think it's important to note that just because we put into place stricter laws, it doesn't mean we will see actual changes. Brazil has some of the strictest laws on deforestation in the world, yet the Amazon is being torn down at an alarming rate. This is because restrictions are not properly enforced, and corporations are putting more money into deforestation and dealing with the fees than the government is into stopping in the first place. Now, as a lot of you probably know, there was a resolution presented to Congress almost 2 years ago now called the Green New Deal that proposes a greener United States. Here, allow my buddy Dan to explain it to you.
At its core, a complete shift to wind and solar at its core. So an idea that if you do that, you will have zero emissions in the next 10 years. But it's an obsession with wind and solar, which I think is interesting. It bans nuclear. Remember when the talking points came out from the Green New Deal, didn't like nuclear. So that's how you know it's not an actual environmental plan, or at least associated with carbon emissions and climate change, because why would you ban the one reliable piece of energy that we have that has zero emissions, which is nuclear? So you know it's not about that. It also includes free healthcare for everybody. It includes free college. So it's like every socialist plan wrapped into one, and then they call it an environmental plan and ban fossil fuels and things like that.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Yeah, don't listen to that. I see a lot of people misrepresenting the Green New Deal, and I want to not only clarify the main points, but add some details that many conservative voices fail to mention. I truly think the Green New Deal could be a good resolution that people on both sides could and probably should get behind. The resolution is essentially a series of actions that will take place over the course of 10 years that can be broken down into 3 goals: create millions of jobs, provide economic security, and counteract systemic injustices. At its core, the Green New Deal is a program to create millions of jobs for Americans, gradually transfer jobs from unsustainable industries to sustainable ones, all while improving the quality of our environment. It mentions upgrading buildings, weatherizing homes, building more energy-efficient homes, and decarbonization. What I don't see people mention a lot is it calls for strengthening of workers' rights to unionize, encourages growth of domestic manufacturing, and creating more affordable public transit. Possibly the worst way to misrepresent this resolution is to reduce it to simply a ban of CO2 and nuclear power and total reliance on solar and wind. Misconceptions. I've heard many people say that the Green New Deal would completely ban air travel, but this is completely incorrect. What it actually says about travel is that high-speed rail and public transit will be built in areas where it would be most effective and efficient rather than less efficient forms of travel.
But Max, it bans a good clean source of energy like nuclear power. That's how you know it's some liberal propaganda.
Now, from what I understand, the Green New Deal doesn't explicitly say anything about nuclear power, like Crenshaw mentions, but let's just say it's implied, which it very well might be. Nuclear power isn't really as clean as a lot of people make it out to be, but more importantly, it's not very safe or cost-effective. I understand that there have only been 3 major catastrophes at nuclear power plants: Fukushima, Chernobyl, and 3 Mile Island. But to be fair, there are not many nuclear power plants in the world to begin with. I think the number is something like 440 in the world. Not to mention that when there is an accident, the outcome is devastating and leaves a lasting scar on the area affected. Kinda makes sense why these aren't put all over the US, obviously aside from the problem of the cost.
For many years, there has been a vigorous debate in this country about the safety of the nation's 72 nuclear energy power plants. That debate is likely to be intensified because of what happened early this morning at a nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania. Max?
Studies have also shown that people who live near nuclear power plants have a higher rate of developing forms of cancer than those who don't. And where are these plants typically built? Lower income neighborhoods. Really, don't get me wrong here. I see the pros and cons that go along with nuclear power, but for me, the safety concerns, along with the fact that it tends to disproportionately hurt lower income neighborhoods, potentially giving them cancer and in some cases poisoning their water, is enough for me to understand why the Green New Deal would want to move away from that as much as possible right now. You might say,
well, Max, if there is supposedly all this evidence that points to our harmful effects on the environment and climate of the earth, then why are there so many people who don't believe in it or don't think it's a problem?
Unfortunately, oil companies have turned what is scientific data into a political stance. You see, the vast majority of Americans not only believe in climate change, but actually think something should be done about it. This isn't that much of a shock, though, because the same thing has been done with other issues that Americans largely agree on as well. Anyway, back to the issue at hand. Why listen to what the scientists have to say when you have arguments like this?
Is there climate change? Yeah. Will it go back like this? I mean, will it change back? Probably. That's what I think. I believe it goes this way, and I believe, yes, man, meaning us people, man and women, to be politically correct. But because everyone says man, but now we have to add women to that one too. Man and women, we do have an impact but I don't believe the impact is nearly what some say, and other scientists that dispute those findings very strongly.
The most compelling points that conservatives bring up frequently about climate issues is that if we place strict restrictions on carbon emissions, the US alone wouldn't be able to make that much of an impact if the rest of the world does not follow, and that we would just be stifling our own economy and oil industry and be left in the dust in terms of the global economy. Here, let my buddy Ben explain it to you.
It's also a basic fact that the only countries that have really been abiding by any of the attempts to reduce climate change have been extraordinarily developed countries. Developing countries have no interest in sacrificing their own people at the altar of climate change.
Now, this could very well be true. Just because the US begins to put restrictions in place in order to ease the release of carbon doesn't mean that other countries will necessarily follow, even if they say they will. However, at the end of the day, coal and oil are finite resources, and scientists believe they could completely run out of oil by 2052. Yes, a transition of renewable energy will be expensive, but what happens when we run out of coal and oil, and all of these jobs that are in industries that rely on coal and oil become extinct? The stronger a country's reliance on fossil fuels, the harder the transition will be when those resources inevitably run out. So why not make the investment now? Why not begin a gradual transition over a decade or two, rather than run full speed into a wall because of a growing reliance on oil and coal, which will potentially ruin several industries and destroy our economy? This is a very real possibility to other countries that entirely rely on oil. Oh, and at the end of the Ben Shapiro clip, he mentioned something like,
These liberals just want to destroy capitalism.
that's my Ben Shapiro voice.
So it's a complex issue, and all the folks who are basically like, let's just kill capitalism. And good luck with that.
He's referring to the fact that the government is putting restrictions on businesses such as a carbon tax. But it's really a good thing because it discourages our use of carbon and forces the economy to move away from fossil fuels and actually reallocate jobs into cleaner forms of energy. And again, all those other countries, just like us, will be forced to move away from coal and oil at some point anyway. If we make it a transition now, we can avoid the mess once that well inevitably runs dry. And we will be in a better position than those countries if that's what's important to you, Ben. Also, if the US discourages the use of carbon emissions, then that will in turn discourage some demand for oil and carbon as well. Shapiro also kind of proves my point that this works earlier in the clip.
Developing countries have no interest in sacrificing their own people at the altar of climate change, and the number one reducer in emissions over the past year was actually the United States.
Why does he say it like it's a bad thing? If you are looking for ways that you yourself can make an impact, last year for school I researched where to go to plant trees. And there are actually several organizations all over that help you plant them, and more importantly, make sure they are planted in areas that will allow them to reach maturity, which is something that is often overlooked. Those links will be in the description below. But in total honesty, it's a lot harder to counteract the destruction by planting trees rather than preventing the issue in the first place. So it might be more effective to just put pressure on the people who are supposed to represent the issues that matter to us. Until Elon gets us to colonize a new planet, I think it's important that we all do our best to protect the one we have now and encourage others to do the same. Thanks. Okay, let me redo that whole part. Cut that.